Welcome to Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we are talking with Bethany Letiecq. She is the faculty member working in a collaboration with the student-led Transparent GMU. Bethany is the president of the GMU chapter of the American Association of University Professors, and she's also an associate professor of human development and family science at George Mason University. Thank you so much for being here, Bethany.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So we were talking a little bit about the donor agreements that seem to impact major things at the university, and one of the examples I think that everyone's familiar with is the naming of the law school to the Antonin Scalia School of Law. Part of that money came from the Koch brothers, and part of it was an anonymous donation. But efforts to find out what was in the donor agreements was rebuffed. The students couldn't find it, even though George Mason University is a public state university. Through Freedom of Information, FOIA, the students were unable to get a copy to find out what was in the agreements. And so they had to resort to using the legal system and the media, by the way, excellent use of the media, to try to get at the heart of what these donor agreements actually give access to, and with the Koch brothers particularly. And I know that you are working with Jasmine Banks, who is the executive director of Unkoch My Campus, which has actually led a national effort to figure out on various campuses where the Koch brothers have funded various institutes and centers exactly how much influence they have over what ideas, what curriculum, what ideologies are being promoted. So I'm going to punt it over to you to kind of explain the genesis of how you got involved with this and how Transparent GMU came into being.
Yeah, well, it's so I'm telling someone else's story here, so hopefully I can tell it well. But my colleague Dave Kiebrick and Sam Parsons, who was a student at George Mason, they really started this effort post Jane Mayer's book coming out on dark money. And Jane Mayer really broke how the Koch network was really gaining undue influence over university and other entities. And she wanted to understand how money was coming into the university and that undue donor influence. And over time, she and other students grew this student organization, Transparent GMU. And you're correct that they started to FOIA the university and FOIA the George Mason University Foundation. And they learned that the foundation is a separate entity, a separate 501c3 private entity. And and because it's a private entity, they do not need to make public the gift agreements that are accepted on behalf of the university to fund various Koch network-related centers, institutes, faculty projects, etc.
So there are actually two existing Koch brother-funded entities affiliated with George Mason University specifically. That's the Institute for Humane Studies and the Mercatus Center. So explain a little about what those different centers do.
Well, again, rather than kind of say what they do and speak on their behalf, what I'd rather do is talk about why these relationships might be problematic.
Right.
So when money comes into the university through the foundation, you don't know the terms and conditions of these gift agreements. You don't know what donors are getting for their dollars. Most donors are restricting their funding into to funding what they're interested in. The university foundation accepts those dollars on behalf of the university, and then the money moves to these centers and institutes, and there are many. It's
right
beyond even Mercatus and the Institute for Humane Studies. In those two instances, however, Charles Koch actually sits on the boards of both of these 501c3s that are affiliated with the university. And these are very complicated relationships. These centers and institutes benefit from the affiliation from the university, and yet they're private and they're controlled by these private interests. So Charles Koch the foundation will move his money through the George Mason University Foundation, which then pushes it into these institutes and centers for them to do their work. Now, the Institute for Humane Studies, you can read about what they do, what they say they do. But what I'm concerned about is that they're using that institute to recruit students and faculty to push out a libertarian agenda. And then the Mercatus Center is using the same processes to push out research that they are funded by the Kochs to do, and then push it out to try to influence policy.
And again, there is an affiliation between these centers and the university, and being a public university, there's a great deal of credibility when you're affiliated with a well-known university. For those of us just joining the show, this is Making Change Radio. I am talking with Bethany Letiecq of George Mason University. She's the president of the GMU chapter of the American Association of University Professors. So, and I'm being reminded that I'm Catherine Reed, your host, here on Radio Fairfax, right? I'm hoping people are listening to us instead of watching the debates, but it's okay. I'm sure that the Democratic debate, is interesting too. Not quite as interesting as what we're talking about. So what I want you to explain to as well is the relationship between with the foundation and not just funding the centers, but they're actually funding, like the president of the university. I mean, I think most of us do not know how the sausage is made.
Yeah, it's complicated. It's very complicated. It's also not that unique. I have to say, George Mason is really not, innovating in this regard.
It's a common practice.
It's a common practice. So the University Foundation is located on the campus, right below the president's office. Presidents are limited by how much money they can earn via the state. And so the foundation subsidizes those salaries. So, for example, President Cabrera was paid roughly 75% of his salary from the GMU Foundation. And where does the GMU Foundation money come from? Well, it comes from people like the Kochs. And so,
But you're telling me that Charles Koch also sits on the board of the foundation.
Not the GMU Foundation. He sits on the board of the Mercatus Center, and he sits on the board of the Institute for Humane Studies.
Got it.
It's hard to follow because there is a lot of sausage being made here.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's troubling because, the call for transparency is because when you can't follow the money, when the money comes into the foundation and it is then hidden from public view, and then the money trickles into the university without any public disclosures, you don't know the terms, you don't know who's getting the money, you don't know the research that's being funded. There isn't a mandate that faculty have to say who funded their research in this regard. So they're publishing in all these different outlets, and no one, you're not mandated to say that this money is coming from the Koch network, et cetera, right? So it's this closed loop system, and what we're trying to do is shine light on it. Let us understand what money's coming in, who's getting funded, what are the terms and conditions of the funds, so that you, the public, can discern, is this undue donor influence? This is a public university. Are these donations taking us down a road that we don't want to go to? Look, the Kochs are anti-tax. They're anti-regulation. They're anti-public education.
Right.
We are taking money from an entity that seeks to destroy us from within. There seems to be some significant conflicts of interest in this game, and we want to understand. We want to shine light on that. and if I can go back, so Transparent GMU FOIA'd the foundation to try to understand some of these terms and conditions.
About following the money. That is just an old axiom that says if you want to know who's driving the bus, then you follow the money. I think one of the things about libertarian, whatever that's a code word for, or being conservative and whatever that's a code word for, the fact that the law school was named after Antonin Scalia, who considered himself an originalist, which means he takes the Constitution verbatim the way it was written by the founders. Well, let's pause for a moment to consider that the founders of our country were propertied white men who built a government and a country for the benefit of propertied white men. That at the time that Constitution was written, black people were enslaved. They weren't even considered people. They were property. Women were chattel. They had very few rights, and we still don't, by the way, since we don't have an ERA. And so when you say libertarian or you say conservative values, to me, this is dog whistle for the people who have benefited most from the way this country was constructed, want to maintain that structure. And it's to their benefit to educate the next generation of people to believe that our country and its wealth was built upon something that was fair and just. And that was kind of my whole problem with the Antonin Scalia School of Law. What he stood for, what he defended, was a flawed document in a time that has changed. And so as an alumni, and I am an alumni of the university, that totally rubbed me the wrong way. To me, that does not represent what I believe Mason should represent as a public university.
Yeah, I agree. It's troubling. And, if you haven't read Nancy McLean's book, A Democracy in Chains, she does an amazing job of unpacking this history. And I do think that this is all about power and control and
who has it,
and these entities maintaining their power and control. And as a university professor, working at a public university that is supposed to support the public good, it's just concerning that we're seeing our public institutions being what we call captured by this libertarian agenda and being used and manipulated to the benefit of a very few instead of, to the benefit of the many. And I think that we should all be terrified by what's happening, particularly at George Mason University, because we are we're ground zero for.
Right,
and maybe that's an inappropriate thing to say.
But let's just say right now
that.
But let's just say too that the Washington Post, the New York Times, it's not like legitimate media has done investigative journalism around this. It's not like you're making this up. It's not like a bunch of students got together and they're starting to see conspiracies where no conspiracies exist.
Yeah.
I think the media's interest and journalism's interest in a pattern. Patterns and practices, patterns and practices. That's what you look for.
Right.
And there is definitely patterns and practices to the way they've gone about this.
Yeah, and if I can, I shared with you earlier, when Angel Cabrera came in, first of all, as a presidential search that was privatized and secretive, he was the sole candidate, and there was no faculty shared governance in his selection. Which is a whole nother story and a whole nother show, but one I encourage you to think about looking into.
We'll do that one,
particularly because we're in a new presidential search with the same the same search firm that is committed to secrecy, as far as I can tell. But when Cabrera came in, the first thing he did is he worked to change the mission statement of the university, and and one of the members of the Board of Visitors at the time, Kimberly Dennis, she is the CEO of the Searle Freedom Trust. And their mission statement says that they will work to support work that will lead to a more just, free, and prosperous society. Angel Cabrera changed our mission statement to align with this libertarian agenda. And now the last 5 or 6 words of our mission statement, a public university is committed to creating a more just, free, and prosperous world. Those words, while they seem like great ideals
On their face.
taken together, this is code language for a libertarian agenda. So Angel actually created an agenda that aligned with this libertarian ideology that has taken over the econ department, the law school, and these institutes and centers. And I think that all public citizens of Virginia should be concerned about this and should be pressuring the administration to redress this.
Well, I think that's the whole idea of transparency. So for those of us just joining the show, this is Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. My guest is Bethany Letiecq of George Mason University. She works in collaboration with the student-led Transparent GMU. And we're talking about the Koch brothers and the influence they've had on the university through donor agreements that no one has access to. And this is something else that the media has uncovered is they have put a lot of money into universities, but an inordinate amount of money proportionally into George Mason University over a long period of time. But if you add it all up, it's millions and millions of dollars over a period of time.
The Kochs
Yes.
have invested over nearly $120 million into George Mason University. And so you have to wonder, what are they getting for their giving?
Exactly. And so, and the fact of the matter is, when you talk about academic freedom, when you talk about diversity of ideas, I'm all about that. I think we're all about, that is what higher education is about. But if you're going to have diversity of ideas, then you need to see the transparency of who's paying to play, right? So if they have a libertarian agenda, then say that's what it is. Say that they're investing in the university because they want their ideas to be represented. But it shouldn't be covered up and pretend like it's something else.
Yeah, there is nothing wrong with teaching about libertarian economic models. There's nothing wrong with exploring free markets. There's nothing wrong with that. What I have a problem with is when you have outside donors that have been given access to hiring faculty, funding their research programs, directing those research outcomes to legislators and policy decision makers that are and are also, by the way, funding the takeover of our judiciary.
Right.
This is a whole nother level. This is so anti-democratic. It's just...
The dissolution of the middle class is that a lot of educated students are getting out of college with a degree, a good education, and a lot of debt and no employment that they can live on, much less pay back the debt. And so this idea that there is not a public good, to me, we just need to face the reality as a public university that we have a responsibility, to these students, and they are struggling. I mean, you look at especially the millennials who will never enjoy the quality of life their parents had. We need to be teaching the reality of the enormous wealth inequality gap in our country and why it exists.
Yeah, and the Koch network in particular has done an amazing job of really leading the state legislative effort to divest from public higher education. So, we talk a lot about how, state dollars are disappearing. And so the universities are, you'll hear this from my administration all the time. We have no choice. We have to turn to these private funders because because the state coffers are drying up. And, and it's irresponsible to not also acknowledge why those state coffers are drying up, and that the Koch network, Americans for Prosperity, their ground game for 40 years has been targeting state legislatures for the very purpose of this divestment of public works to include higher education, public PK through 12 education, etc. So this is part of that closed loop. This has been their agenda, and now you have university leadership who is hired for the sole purpose of cultivating these donor networks to fund the universities. I mean, this provides the pathway for these donors to really capture universities and manipulate them for their own personal gain, to the incredible cost of the public, the incredible cost of individuals and families who are now sharing a huge part of the burden, for their education.
And I think I've always believed that part of the vulnerability of George Mason University is the fact that we're a new university. Mm-hmm. It was funded by developers who wanted a university in Northern Virginia. They needed to grow it quickly. Mm-hmm. We are not Tech. We're not William & Mary. We're not UVA. We don't have a lot of dead alumni or dead wealthy alumni. We basically we're building this major university quickly. Mm-hmm. And that really meant looking around for people who were not alumni to fund it. And I think when we come back from our break, mm-hmm. that's one of the things we really need to talk about is the agenda of the people who from the beginning built the university. And all you have to do is look around the campus and their names are on the buildings. But you expect that. You know, when somebody gives you money, you're like, oh, it's the Volgano School of Engineering. Okay, we built you a building. You gave us an endowment, and that's terrific. When we come back from the break, we're going to dig into this deeper. So please stay tuned.
We are Radio Fairfax.
Rivers of Living Water is a program that features uplifting sermons, abundant grace, unwavering faith, spirit-led life, work of the cross of Jesus in the radical of our Heavenly Father.
You're a good Father.
Tune in to Rivers of Living Water, Fridays at 4 p.m. on Radio Fairfax.
It's who you are.
Hello, my name's Matthew Moore, the host of the Psychedelic Circus. The circus has moved. I'm on Sunday nights now from 6 to 8 p.m. Join me for the Psychedelic Circus, where the buzz can shake you clean.
In 1957, Frank Sinatra said,
"Rock and roll smells phony and false. It is sung, played, and written for the most part by cretinous goons. It manages to be the martial music of every sideburn delinquent on the face of the earth. It is the most brutal, ugly, desperate, vicious form of expression it's ever been my misfortune to hear."
Way to go, Frank. If you agree with him, good luck to you. But if you want to hear some good early rock and roll and rockabilly, tune in every Thursday at 4 p.m. to the Professor Rocks.
There are a ton of social networking websites, but one stands apart for a very special reason. This one saves lives. It's MatchingDonors.com. MatchingDonors.com links organ donors with people in need of kidney and other transplants. In the U.S., 19 people die each day waiting for an organ transplant, most of them for kidneys. If you've ever considered becoming a living organ donor, or if you're someone in need of an organ transplant, visit MatchingDonors.com, home of the greatest gift of all, the gift of life, MatchingDonors.com.
An important message from Medicare.
When my son first told me about extra help from Medicare, I said, thanks, but no thanks. I didn't want any help paying for my prescriptions. I told him, I don't have much money coming in, but I still have my pride. Besides, I looked into it a couple years ago. I figured if I didn't qualify then, I wouldn't qualify now either. My, oh my, am I ever glad my son didn't give up on me. He reminded me that I was on a limited income and that it was easier than ever for people like me to qualify. So I called, and he was right. Now I pay just a few dollars for generics and a few dollars more for brand name prescriptions. With extra help, I can afford the prescriptions I need. Thanks, Medicare.
Get the extra help you need to stay healthy. Visit socialsecurity.gov or call 1-800-772-1213.
Radio Fairfax is a 501c3 nonprofit based in Fairfax, Virginia.
Welcome to Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we are talking with Bethany Letiecq. She is the faculty member working in a collaboration with the student-led Transparent GMU. Bethany is the president of the GMU chapter of the American Association of University Professors, and she's also an associate professor of human development and family science at George Mason University. Thank you so much for being here, Bethany.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So we were talking a little bit about the fact that George Mason is a newer university with a great deal of ambition. I think by enrollment, we are now the largest university in Virginia. That happened very quickly. You know, William and Mary's kind of been working at it since the 1600s. And so there were a lot of people, developers, business people in Northern Virginia who really felt like the growth of this region depended on having a university in Northern Virginia that was equal or superior to the universities in the other parts of the state. And so I have to believe that made the university far more vulnerable to people who came bearing bags of money saying, we can help you achieve your goals. And we've had a lot of local donors too. So we can say, you know, the Koch brothers and their donor agreements, which we don't know what they consist of, are problematic. But the fact of the matter is the university takes a lot of donor money, not just from the Koch brothers, but they take a lot of donor money. And I think for the most part, you know, people endow a chair or they're interested in a particular school, like the Schar School, you know, is named after Dwight Schar, you know, and I'm glad for his investment. But I don't necessarily believe that Dwight Schar is deciding who sits on the faculty. I think Mark Rozelle is deciding who sits on the faculty. And that, to me, is where there's a difference.
Yes, I think it's really important. Look, you know, the reality is that that universities are in a pickle. We have seen, and so that has put us in a bind. But when people buy a building, give $10 million to have their name put on a building, that's one thing. They get the prestige of having their family's crest on this building. But those agreements are not determining which faculty will be hired. There's no there shouldn't be involvement in selection committees and retention committees and those sorts of things. That is the charge of the faculty. In a healthy public university, you have healthy shared governance, and people know their roles and the lanes that they should occupy. The difference here is that the Kochs and their network of donors very strategically look, donors used to give to universities in unrestricted ways.
Right. Unrestricted funds are what everybody wants.
So when there was a shift in donor giving to restrict giving so that you only fund what you're interested in or committed to. When that happens and these donors get to determine, hiring of faculty, firing of faculty, in some cases, in some universities, even the curriculum that will be taught at those institutions, that goes far beyond a name on a building. Now you're talking about violating core tenets of academic freedom, academic independence, academic integrity, and the function of faculty at a university. The faculty protect and are committed to the production of knowledge. When you have donors coming in and dangling these carrots and saying, if you teach from this book, I'll give you 10 million.
Right.
Now you have corruption within the institution. You have sold your independence, and we're no longer an institution of higher education. Now we're doing the bidding of moneyed interests. That runs counter to the very integrity of, to what my purpose is as a faculty member.
And I think the naming of the law school really sent a very clear signal. A lot of I was surprised, and yet my husband, who's an attorney, says, well, everybody knows it's a conservative law school. I'm like, no, I don't know that everybody knew that, Tom. I didn't know that. But when you put that on the name of the law school, clearly you're signaling that this is what the law school embraces. I mean, and the fact that 20 million of that was an anonymous donor.
And there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that anonymous donor is in some way connected through Leonard Leo to the Federalist Society. And I mean, the law school is so captured, and they are, they are pushing out their professors who are legitimated in many ways by their affiliation from the law school. And then they're moving into the judiciary through these appointments. I mean, Steve Menashe right now is, looking to be confirmed to a appeals court. There's many people who are Koch-funded, Koch-backed, Koch-placed at the university, and now are serving in the Trump administration in a variety of ways. And I'll tell you one other story that just is an example of how I see this as just so corrupting. George Mason University now employs 3 Supreme Court justices for their law school. We have Gorsuch, Clarence Thomas, and of course now Kavanaugh.
Kavanaugh, oh great.
Are the 3. On average, adjunct faculty at George Mason University earn roughly, the lowest paid, earn roughly about $2,500 a 3-credit
course,
15-week course. That actually, if you do the math, it translates to about $15 an hour.
It's adjunct professors are the day laborers of education right now.
Brett Kavanaugh's contract through the law school, he teaches a 2-credit co-taught course with another professor at the law school for 2 weeks, and his contract grants him $25,000 annually, and it's the same contract with the other 2 as well, I believe. But can we just sit with this for 1 minute? So the Koch brothers and the Federalist Society are pouring millions of dollars into the George Mason Law School. The law school is employing 3 Supreme Court justices who are getting unduly enriched, being paid so much more than any other, adjunct faculty
at a public university.
And these guys are on the Supreme Court making decisions that are absolutely going to benefit the corporate interest, the private interest of the Kochs and their brethren throughout the land. This should be horrifying.
Right. It's self-serving.
Horrifying.
It's self-serving. It's self-dealing. And as you said, I love your analogy that it's a closed loop. It's a closed loop. This is a cycle. So you bring prestigious conservative justices in to attract people to the law school so that they are on the same track, on the same path to be those same people. It is a closed loop. That's a great analogy. That's a great visual on that. Yeah. So for those of you just joining us, this is Making Change Radio. We are talking about Transparent GMU with Bethany Letiecq, who is an associate professor of human development and family science at George Mason University. I want to talk a little bit about your relationship with Unkoch My Campus. The executive director, Jasmine Banks, has been very active here in Virginia. Yesterday, there was the Virginia Supreme Court heard arguments in the case, trying to use the legal system, working through the legal system to get access to these donor agreements. So explain a little bit about Uncook My Campus and the relationship between Transparent GMU and what they're doing.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and really, I appreciate it. So Sam Parsons, who was one of the co-founders of Transparent GMU at Mason while she was an undergraduate there, moved on to co-found Uncook My Campus, which became a national entity, and they seek to surface this undue donor influence across the country. Looking at George Mason as an example for what you can look at through those gift agreements and the terms and conditions that might be problematic at our institution, and are they at your institution as well? So Uncook is trying to now work at a national scale to surface these undue donor agreements and also to foster change on campus. So at George Mason, with the uncovering of a multitude of gift agreements that finally exposed all the ways in which donors had undue influence on our campus, Transparent GMU worked in collaboration with the faculty through the Faculty Senate and through the AUP at Mason, and with Uncook My Campus, and with community people who are also just highly invested in fighting for this public institution that they love, that we all love, and we're really trying to protect it from this corruption. So in order to make change, it's not one person, right? So we all collaborated and worked so hard together to expose these agreements and to really work on policy reform. And the thing that I love most about Transparent GMU, I mean, imagine this is a group of college students who showed up every month to Faculty Senate meetings to protest, who did all kinds of things to expose this story and to educate faculty and the public at large about what was happening on their watch. And I'm just in awe that students care so much about gift agreements.
Right.
And that they helped us fashion the language to produce better policy on our college campus, to ultimately produce more transparency going forward, and that college students care about this and are so dedicated, so passionate. It is one of the most inspiring things I have been a part of as a faculty member, and I'm constantly, asking my colleagues to join with me to learn from these students and learn from the amazing work of Uncook My Campus and how they're building this national network. And the thing that I'll say there too that I've appreciated them personally is that they have connected me with faculty from across the nation who we are now working in common cause to support one another, to try to push back against this. Because I got to tell you, it's uncomfortable when your boss or your president of your university, suggests in public that you're just a conspiracy theorist and whatever, whatever my goals are, and it's quite threatening. And of course, the hate mail and the hate emails and the threats that can come my way, as a faculty member, I don't have resources to protect myself against a lot of these threats and whatnot. So to have this support network,
people
and this
that you
network
can
of
band together with, band together with people.
I think it's a really important part because faculty feel incredibly vulnerable on campuses. some 70% of faculty at Mason, and don't quote me on that, but there's a large percentage of faculty who don't have tenure and don't have job protections at all. And so for anybody to dive into this kind of stuff is incredibly threatening because they can lose their job and lose their livelihood. And so it's actually something that we've needed students to lead on this in some ways because faculty are too vulnerable to take this on.
Well, and you point out something, quite problematic, and that is the filling in with adjunct professors, paying them less. Literally, they are the day laborers of higher education so that you don't have to pay them benefits or a salary or put them on a tenure track, or to not have the bulk of your professors and your teaching staff be tenured. This is the erosion of unions in this country.
Yeah.
This is the erosion of defined pension plans. This is the erosion of everything that kept and maintained a middle class in this country.
Right.
And that's why we have this growing wealth gap, this intense, income inequality. People talk about divisiveness and polarization, but the people who have the resources and the people who have the power are not interested in making sure we have a strong middle class. They will survive without a strong middle class. Yeah. We send these young people to college campuses to help them to be critical thinkers. And this is what you're saying is being demonstrated to you. Their parents sent them here to learn higher critical thinking skills, and they've applied that to something that they see as an issue. And I have to say, the thing that gets people the most, and I work with a lot of nonprofits on messaging, you have to appeal to people's sense of what is just, right, and fair. And when people feel that something is not just, right, and fair, that's when they decide to act. That's what that's how you organize people, is around this. So there was a arguments made at the Supreme Court yesterday on September 11th. At some point there will be something from those judges.
In about 6 weeks, we've heard.
And so the argument you are making is what?
So in that particular case, what we were trying to do is open up these foundations to public scrutiny. We want to know what's behind the vault. There are hundreds and hundreds of gift agreements, and we want to know what the terms and conditions the university has agreed to, and essentially what strings are attached to any remaining gift agreements that have not been made public. It is through that level of transparency that you can begin to follow the money. We want to see the money coming in, from whom, and then what the terms and conditions, and then where it goes. And when you can follow the money, you can see how the money is either influencing the university in ways that are constructive and positive, or ways that might be corrupting the university. And there's another great example in the news these days when you look at MIT, what's going on with the Media Lab. I mean, this is happening across the country, and so.
Well, right, and there's a lot of things going on at universities right now. I mean, the whole parents bribing, people are going to jail over this. But look how vulnerable people working at colleges are, in that they were willing to compromise themselves and their university, Stanford, of payoffs. Yeah. I mean, we should all be alarmed that this is happening.
Yeah, I mean, there's greed and corruption is a force to be reckoned with. And what we need more than ever, particularly at public universities, we need leadership that has an incredibly strong moral compass to be able to stand up against corruption and undue influence. Listen, I am not against money coming in.
Sure,
we need it.
Nobody wants to turn away money.
We need it, but we should be ready to look at the terms and conditions and renegotiate them to make sure that they uphold our principles of academic freedom and academic independence. And if we cannot reach that accord with a donor, then we must be brave and walk away from those dollars. And through transparency, so many people, legislators, others, are so concerned that if we open up these foundations to public scrutiny, they're so afraid that donors are going to go away. But I say, what donors are going to get, like donors who have something to hide? Then let's cultivate a different kind of donor community that will be proud of the kinds of agreements that they're generating in support of public higher education. And it's important to note that the public university foundations that are public, which some 10 states have foundations that are public bodies, their funding is not drying up. So
right.
There is no evidence to suggest that when Transparent GMU, should they win this lawsuit, and these public foundations have to open up their coffer, their records to public scrutiny, there's no indication that money will dry up. Now, what will be problematic is the uncovering of the history of untoward agreements that embarrass signatories, administrators who were involved in selling out public universities to the highest bidder.
Well, and that's accountability, and you would expect that there should be a certain amount of accountability. I just want to remind people of the two books that you talked about, Dark Money and Democracy in Chains. Yeah. You are not making things up. Several people have said to me that Dark Money is just eye-opening, very revelatory in what it has to say and how they followed the money trail. Mm-hmm. I'm going to encourage people to follow Transparent GMU on Twitter. That's at Transparent GMU. Transparent GMU also has a Facebook page where content is posted. And there's a website, unkochmycampus.org. And again, you will see tons of press on unkochmycampus.org, both about George Mason University and about the other universities that find themselves in similar positions of trying to figure out what agreements were made in exchange for the millions and millions of dollars that the Koch brothers have invested.
Yeah, if you're interested, we're trying to build a database called the Academic Capture Warning System, where you can go in and see what money is coming in and who seems to be capturing different units on campuses across the country. It's just beginning, but there's a lot going on as we work to fight back against this corruption and this conflict of interest that is eroding our the quality of our public higher education institutions.
And I think it's very brave for you to take this stand. I am in admiration of the young people doing this, but as a faculty member, you have a lot more to lose. And so it takes a lot of courage to stand up and say, I'm going to be with these young people because it's in the best interest of this university and the integrity of the academic freedom that we all have always believed George Mason University stood for.
Yeah, thank you so much. And, we are nothing without our integrity. We are nothing without our academic principles. Without fighting for those and protecting those, we're nothing. So, I love my job, and these students just have absolutely inspired me to take those risks, and I'm hoping that others will join me, and many have, and we have a lot more work to do, and we're excited to keep pushing because it's worth the fight.
Yeah, and as I said, the public. I'm an alumna of George Mason University. There are some of us around. I'm one of the early ones from the early '80s, and I think the alumni should get involved in this. I'm very proud of the university. I'm very proud to say I'm a graduate of George Mason University. There are things that I believe that the university stands for, and the fact that you are safeguarding that integrity, I appreciate so much that people are looking out for the integrity, the reputation of George Mason University. So thank you so much, Bethany Letiecq, for being my guest here on Making Change Radio. I want to encourage all of our listeners to follow this. There is no shortage of media. All you have to do is Google it. And if you do that, you're going to, I think, be motivated to support the efforts of these many students and faculty members. Join us next week. Making Change Radio is every Thursday night, 9 p.m. here at Radio Fairfax.